My name is Brooke Lawson, and I learned early that money can be a weapon. In my last year of high school, I brought home a thick envelope with my dream school printed on the front. I had worked for it late nights, extra credits, and weekend shifts, and I walked into the kitchen smiling. Frank Lawson, my father, did not smile back. He sat at the table, calm and certain, like he had been waiting. Carol Lawson, my mother, stood near the sink, hands busy, eyes avoiding mine. Evan Lawson, my brother, leaned against the counter, grinning like this was entertainment. I started to talk about scholarships and housing and how excited I was, but Frank held up one hand and stopped me. He said there was no point because the college fund was not mine anymore. He said the $175,000 that had been saved for my education was going to Evan. Frank said Evan needed it more because he had big plans and a serious future. Evan laughed and said he deserved it because he was going to business school and build something real. Frank turned to me and told me I should learn a trade because college was wasted on me. The room felt smaller and the air felt thin, and I could hear my own heart beating. I reminded Frank that the money came from my grandmother, Margaret Hale, and that it was meant for me. Frank said Margaret gave it to the family and he could decide how to use it. Carol whispered that we should not fight and that I could figure something out, but she did not defend me. Evan kept smiling, like the punchline was my face. I tried to argue, but Frank talked over me, and he said I was being dramatic. He said if I wanted a future, I could pay for it myself and stop acting entitled. That night, I lay in bed, staring at my acceptance letter, feeling like it belonged to someone else. I did not know yet how deep the betrayal went or how many years it would shape. I only knew one thing. My own father had just chosen my brother and told me to survive without help. The next morning, Frank Lawson acted like nothing happened, like he had not reached into my future and taken it. He drank coffee, read the news, and told me I should be grateful he was giving me practical advice. He said college was for people with direction, and he said I should learn a trade because I would never compete in the real world. Evan Lawson walked past me with a smug smile and said he was going to do big things and that I should not be jealous. Carol Lawson tried to soften it, telling me I could take a year off work and figure it out, but her voice sounded like surrender, not support. I carried my acceptance letter around like a bruise, and every time I looked at it, I felt heat behind my eyes. At school, teachers congratulated me, and friends asked where I was going, and I lied because the truth felt humiliating. At night, I searched for loans, grants, and cheap options, but the numbers never worked. $175,000 was a wall I could not climb. Not at 18, not with my part-time paycheck. I asked Frank again, calmly, to reconsider, and he snapped, saying the money belonged to the family, and family needed results. He said Evan was an investment, and I was a risk. When I said the fund came from Margaret Hale, he got defensive and said my grandmother had no right to dictate the household. Carol looked away, and that hurt almost as much as his words. I realized I was living in a house where my dreams were treated like a joke. The air felt heavy, and my room felt like a waiting room, and I could not breathe without feeling watched. I started packing quietly, not dramatically, just folding clothes, gathering documents, and hiding cash for my shifts. I told myself I would leave after graduation, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt myself shrinking. One evening, Evan bragged about his program and asked if I wanted to be his assistant someday. Frank laughed, and Carol forced a small smile. Something in me broke cleanly, like a thread snapping. I stood up from the table, walked to my room, and decided I would not stay long enough to be erased. 2 weeks after I left, I got a call from a number I did not recognize, and I almost ignored it. A calm man introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, and he said he had represented my grandmother, Margaret Hale. He asked if I was safe, and the word safe made my throat tighten. Daniel said Margaret had left instructions for me separate from the college fund my father controlled. He said it was not a fortune, but it was real, and it was meant to help me stand up on my own. When we met, he slid a folder across a small office table, and he spoke carefully, like he knew how families can be. Inside was a letter from Margaret, written in steady handwriting, telling me she believed in me, and she wanted me to have options. She wrote that some people confuse control with love, and that I should never trade my dignity for approval. Daniel explained that Margaret had placed a small trust for me, $12,000, and it would be released only to me, not to Frank Lawson, not to Carol Lawson, not to Evan Lawson. My hands shook as I read, because it felt like my grandmother had reached through the noise and grabbed my wrist. I wanted to cry, but I forced myself to focus, because I needed a plan more than a breakdown. Daniel asked what I wanted to do, and I told him the truth. I wanted school, but I could not afford the dream version anymore. He nodded and said there are many roads to the same life, and pride does not pay tuition. I left that office with the folder tucked under my arm and a strange mix of grief and relief in my chest. Grief because Margaret was gone, and relief because she had seen the danger in my house, and she had prepared a rope for me to climb. That night, I sat in my small rented room, wrote out a budget, and stared at the number 12,000 like it was a lifeline. It was not enough to buy the future I imagined, but it was enough to buy time, and time was exactly what Frank had tried to steal. I used that money like a tool, not like a celebration. I paid a deposit on a tiny place, bought a used laptop, and enrolled in community college classes that I could afford without drowning. I worked every job I could get, coffee shop mornings, retail evenings, and weekend shifts that left my feet aching. I kept my head down, because shame was loud, and I did not want it to direct me. In my first semester, I took an introductory design course by accident, and something clicked in my brain, like a door opening. The instructor talked about space, light, color, and function, and I felt alive in a way I had not felt in months. I started building small projects, posters for local events, simple layouts for small businesses, and I stayed late in the lab learning software until the campus lights dimmed. Frank Lawson texted once, asking if I had come to my senses. Evan Lawson posted photos of his new life, expensive suit, fancy school, big words about entrepreneurship. Carol Lawson sent a short message that said she missed me, but she did not mention the money, and she did not mention fairness. I stopped expecting comfort from them, and I focused on progress. I applied for scholarships. I filled out forms until my wrists hurt, and I accepted that the path would be slower. The trade Frank mocked became a strange joke in my head because I was learning a skill, and that skill was building a life. By the end of the year, I had a small portfolio, a steady routine, and a quiet confidence that did not depend on anyone clapping. I told myself that one day I would have a career that could not be taken with one decision at a kitchen table. I did not know how far it would go yet, but I knew this. I was no longer asking for permission to grow. In the months that followed, I learned how different our lives looked when money is handed to you versus when you earn every inch. Evan Lawson posted photos like he was already a success, shiny offices, networking events, and expensive dinners he called investments. Frank Lawson loved it, and he talked about Evan like a trophy, the son with vision, the son who would make the family proud. Meanwhile, I was juggling classes, rent, and groceries, counting quarters at the checkout, and choosing which bill could wait a few more days. Carol Lawson sent small messages on holidays, asking if I was eating enough, but she never asked if what Frank did was wrong. I stopped replying, because concern without action felt like a performance. I kept building my portfolio, and I kept showing up for every shift, even when my body begged for rest. Some nights, I sat at my tiny desk, staring at my laptop screen, thinking about the $175,000 that could have made my path easier. Then I would remember Frank's face and Evan's grin, and the anger would sharpen into focus. I was not going to drown. Just to prove a point, I was going to climb, because climbing was the only choice I had left. One afternoon, I ran into Evan Lawson outside a cafe near campus, and he acted like we were old friends. He asked how my little classes were going, and he said it was good I was keeping busy, because not everyone is meant for big dreams. He said Frank Lawson made a smart move, putting the fund into someone who would multiply it. I stared at him, and for a second, I could not speak, because the cruelty was so casual. I told him the money was meant for me, and he shrugged, like fairness was a childish word. He said, Margaret Hale would have wanted the family to win, and he said I should stop living in the past. That was when I understood. Evan did not just benefit, he agreed with the theft. And he enjoyed it. I walked away without another word, because arguing with someone like that only feeds them. Later, I called Daniel Mercer, and I asked one question. Could Frank Lawson legally move that money? Daniel paused, then said the answer depended on how it was held, and what paperwork existed. He told me to keep records, save messages, and protect myself, because people who take once often take again. I hung up, and I felt something settle inside me, not revenge, but clarity. I would build my life, and I would also protect the truth, because someday the truth would matter. That semester, my design instructor pulled me aside after class and asked why I looked exhausted all the time. I almost lied, out of habit, but I told her I was working multiple jobs and trying to stay enrolled. She looked at my portfolio, and she said I had talent, and talent deserves a chance. She helped me apply for a small scholarship, then another, and she connected me with a local studio that needed an intern. The pay was not glamorous, but it was experience, and it was a door. On my first day, I walked into a bright workspace, and I felt like I could finally breathe. I learned how to talk to clients, how to present ideas, how to accept feedback without shrinking. At night, I still worked a second job, but now I was building towards something real. When the internship turned into part-time work, I bought myself a used blazer from a thrift store, and I wore it like armor. Frank Lawson did not know, and Evan Lawson did not care, and Carol Lawson stayed quiet, but their silence stopped defining me. Margaret Hale letter stayed in my drawer, and I read it when my confidence dipped. She wrote that dignity is a skill, and I practiced it every day. By the end of that year, I was not just surviving. I was starting to become the person I always knew I could be. The internship turned into real responsibility, and that changed how I saw myself. I was still working long hours, but now the work meant something, because my designs went out into the world. I built a clean portfolio. I learned to speak with confidence in meetings, and I learned that clients respect clarity more than perfection. Some weeks, I ate ramen and peanut butter, and I still counted my money at the register, but I stopped feeling ashamed of it. I told myself that struggle was not proof of failure. It was proof of motion. Daniel Mercer checked in once, reminding me to keep copies of anything related to the college fund, because paperwork is the only language certain people fear. I saved old messages from Evan Lawson, and I kept notes about what Frank Lawson said, because memory can be attacked, but records do not argue. When a small local business paid me for a logo, I framed the first check in my mind, not the paper, but the meaning. I was building a trade, just not the one Frank demanded. I was building the trade of making something from nothing, and that skill would never belong to him. Around my 3rd year, I heard through an old friend that Evan Lawson's new plans were not going well. His business school friends had stopped returning calls, and the startup he bragged about was burning cash. Frank Lawson still talked like Evan was on the edge of greatness, but his confidence sounded strained, like he was forcing the story to stay alive. Carol Lawson sent me a message asking how I was doing, and I answered politely, because I did not want war. I wanted distance. She asked if I could come to dinner sometime, just to talk. I did not go, because I knew dinner at that table always came with a price. I kept focusing on my work, and the studio trusted me with bigger clients. I took on branding projects. I learned user experience basics, and I started mentoring younger interns, because teaching makes you realize what you know. Some nights I still felt that old anger, the kitchen table, the acceptance letter, the $175,000 that was never meant for Evan. But the anger did not own my mornings anymore. My mornings belonged to my goals, and my goals were finally paying me back. The first big break came from a client who noticed my work and asked if I could handle a full rebrand for a growing company. I said yes before I had time to doubt myself. Then I went home and studied until sunrise. The project was intense and the deadlines were tight, but I delivered, and the client referred me to 2 more people. My supervisor started treating me less like an intern and more like a designer with a future. I began saving real money for the first time, not much, but enough to breathe. I upgraded my laptop. I moved into a slightly better apartment, and I paid bills without panic. One night, after a long day, I opened Margaret Hale's letter again, and I read the line about dignity. I realized I had been practicing dignity in every decision, in every shift, in every late-night class. Frank Lawson used the word trade like an insult, but the trade I learned was resilience with a backbone. I did not need his approval, and I did not need his money to become someone he could not dismiss. By the time I finished my program, I was not asking anyone for permission anymore. I had a portfolio I trusted, a work history I earned, and a small circle that knew the real story. I took a full-time role at the studio, and I started building a name that did not depend on the Lawson house. Frank Lawson still did not call, and Evan Lawson still posted confident updates, but I stopped watching. Carol Lawson sent a message once, saying she missed me and asking if I could visit. I wrote back kindly, but I did not agree to dinner, because dinner was where my future got taken. I kept my distance, and I used my energy on work, on skill, and on stability. Daniel Mercer reminded me to keep every record, because families who rewrite truth often do it again when money is involved. I kept copies of my acceptance letter, my old texts, and notes from that first kitchen conversation, because I wanted facts, not feelings. When a client praised my work in a meeting, I felt a quiet shift inside me. I was no longer the girl who needed a fund to be valid. I was a professional, and my value was not a favor someone could revoke. I started saving more, and I opened a separate account for future education, because I still believed in learning, even if my path looked different. Each month I added a little, and each month I felt less afraid. I used to imagine winning as a public moment, like a speech or a reunion. Instead, winning looked like paying rent on time, sleeping without panic, and waking up excited to build something. The Lawson name became background noise, and my own name became the focus. News about Evan Lawson came in fragments, through old friends and quiet social posts. The confident photos slowed down, the captions became vague, and the shiny promises started sounding defensive. A friend told me Evan was asking people for introductions and pitching ideas that never landed. Another, said the startup burned through cash, and Evan blamed everyone but himself. Frank Lawson still acted like Evan was one breakthrough away, but his voice sounded tighter, like he was holding a story together with force. Carol Lawson called me late one night, and her tone was careful, like she did not want to anger anyone. She said things were stressful at home, and she asked if I could check in on Frank because he was worried about money. That sentence hit me like a cold splash. Money was the reason I lost my future, and now they were calling me when their version was failing. I told Carol I hoped they were well, but I was not the solution to a problem they created. Carol started to cry, and she said she wished it had gone differently. I wanted to believe her, but wishing never protected me. After the call, I sat at my desk and opened Margaret Hale letter again. It reminded me that some families love control more than truth. I did not feel joy about Evan struggling. I felt clarity. Evan was never the point. The point was how easily they sacrificed me, because they assumed I would adapt quietly. I did adapt, but not the way they expected. I built a life that did not need their table, and I stopped being the backup plan for their mistakes. A few months later, Frank Lawson finally reached out, not with warmth, but with a message that sounded like authority. He wrote that we should talk, and he said it was time to put the past behind us. He did not ask how I was, and he did not mention the college fund. He just wanted a reset, like he could press a button and return to control. I did not answer right away. I read it. Then I put my phone down and I went back to a client project because I refused to let his timing steer my day. That night, I spoke with Daniel Mercer, and I asked what I could do if I ever needed to challenge what happened. Daniel said it depended on the structure of the account and the paper trail, and he said I should not confront Frank without facts. He told me to stay calm and keep everything documented because people who take money often rely on intimidation, not legality. The next morning, I replied to Frank briefly and clearly. I said I would talk only if the conversation included the truth, and only if he stopped dismissing what he did. Frank responded fast and his tone turned sharp, saying I was ungrateful and I was making trouble, and I should accept his guidance. I recognized the pattern, the same pattern from the kitchen table, the moment he decided Evan mattered more. I did not argue. I told Frank I was building my own future, and I would not discuss it like it was a negotiation. Then I ended the thread, and I felt my chest loosen, because I had finally learned a rule that saved me. When someone offers peace, but refuses accountability, they are not offering peace. They are offering silence. After that exchange, Frank Lawson went quiet again, and the silence felt like a tactic. He wanted me to feel guilty, to chase him, to prove I still needed his approval. I did not. I focused on my work, and I started taking freelance projects on the side because I wanted more control over my income. The studio trusted me with bigger accounts, and clients began asking for me by name. I learned how to negotiate, how to set boundaries, and how to say no without apologizing. That was a new skill, and it felt like freedom. Daniel Mercer checked in once and reminded me that if Frank ever tried to twist the truth publicly, I should be ready with facts. I kept my file updated because I no longer believed in fairness as a natural force. Fairness has to be defended. Evan Lawson posted less, but when he did, the posts sounded forced, like he was selling confidence he did not feel. I stopped caring about his image. I had my own life to build, and my own bills to pay, and my own future to protect. Some nights I still thought about the $175,000 and what it would have changed. Then I looked at what I built without it, and I felt a different kind of pride, quieter, but stronger. The first real crack showed up in a phone call from Carol Lawson. She sounded nervous, and she asked if I had heard from Evan Lawson. I said no, and my voice stayed calm. But my stomach tightened. Carol said Evan had missed a payment, and Frank Lawson was furious, and the house felt tense. She did not say what payment, but I could hear the shape of the problem. Money was slipping, and they were looking for someone to blame, or someone to fix it. Carol said Evan had borrowed more than Frank admitted, and some of it was tied to the same fund, the one that was supposed to be mine. Hearing that made my hands go cold. Frank had not just redirected the money, he had gambled with it, and Evan had treated it like fuel, not like responsibility. Carol asked if I could talk to Evan, because he might listen to me. That almost made me laugh, because Evan never listened, he only spoke. I told Carol I hoped Evan found a solution, but I was not stepping back into that mess. Carol cried softly, and she said she wished she had protected me years ago. I said I wished that too. And I meant it, but wishing was not a plan. After we hung up, I opened my folder and I reviewed every note, every message, every detail. If the fund was mishandled, I wanted to know. Because the truth matters more when people start panicking. I met Daniel Mercer in his office again, and I brought my questions like a list. I asked what happens if a parent moves money from an account meant for a child and uses it for someone else. Daniel explained that it depends on the legal structure, but there are rules, and there are records, and people do get caught when they ignore them. He said if the fund was held under a custodial arrangement, the custodian has duties, and moving the money for another child can be a violation. He did not promise an easy win, but he said I was not wrong to ask. He also warned me that families often weaponize shame to stop you from seeking answers. He told me to stay steady and to collect proof, because proof changes power. I left his office with a clearer mind and a heavier heart. Part of me wanted to walk away forever and never look back. Another part of me wanted the truth on record, not for revenge, but because stealing a future should have consequences. I did not file anything yet, and I did not threaten Frank Lawson. I simply prepared. If they came back into my life, it would not be on their terms, and it would not be built on silence. The more I learned, the more the past stopped feeling like a bad memory and started feeling like a recorded decision. Frank Lawson had told everyone I was dramatic, and Evan Lawson had acted like he earned what he took, but now their confidence looked thinner. Carol Lawson called again, and this time she admitted Frank was under pressure. Bills were stacking up, and Evan Lawson was not delivering the success story he promised. I listened without reacting, because I could feel the trap forming, the slow push to make me responsible for their choices. Carol, said Frank, kept saying he did what was best for the family, and that I would have wasted the money anyway. Hearing that made my jaw tighten, because even in panic he still needed to insult me. I told Carol I was not discussing my worth, and I was not stepping into a crisis created by theft. Carol went quiet, and then she asked what I wanted. I said I wanted the truth acknowledged, and I wanted my name cleared, and I wanted them to stop pretending the fund was a gift they had the right to redirect. After the call, I sat at my desk, opened my folder, and organized everything. By date, by message, by event. I saved receipts, letters, and old-school documents because I had learned that the people who hurt you will always claim you are confused. I was not confused. I was prepared. Frank Lawson finally asked to meet, and he did it like a command, not a request. He said we should talk face to face, and he said it was time to act like adults. The irony almost made me smile, because adults do not steal from their children, then demand respect for it. I agreed to a meeting, but only in a public place, during daylight, and only for a limited time. Daniel Mercer advised me to keep it calm, and to let Frank talk, because people reveal more when they think they are in control. When I arrived, Frank was already there, sitting stiff, eyes sharp, posture rigid. He looked older, but the expression was the same, annoyed and certain, like I was wasting his time. Evan Lawson did not come, which felt like strategy, because he liked to hide behind Frank power. Carol Lawson came late, and she sat quietly, hands folded, like she wanted peace more than truth. Frank started talking about family and loyalty, and how hard it has been. He did not start with an apology, and he did not start with fact. He started with pressure, and that told me he had not changed. I let him talk. Then I asked one simple question: where is the $175,000 now? Frank blinked, and his mouth tightened, because he did not expect me to go straight to the core. Frank Lawson tried to dodge, and he said the money was used for Evan Lawson education, and that should be the end of it. I told him it would not be the end because the fund was meant for me, for Margaret Hale, and he knew that. Frank leaned forward and said Margaret had no right to control his household. I answered that Margaret had every right to protect her granddaughter, and she did, which is why she left me $12,000 outside his reach. Frank flinched at that, because it proved Margaret did not trust him. Carol Lawson looked down, like she had been carrying that truth and pretending it was not heavy. Frank accused me of being ungrateful, and he said I should have learned a trade and moved on. I told him I did learn a trade. I learned how to build a life with no safety net, and I learned how to document everything. Then I said I had spoken with Daniel Mercer, and I understood there are duties tied to custodial funds, and choices leave paper trails. Frank went still, and for the first time, his anger looked uncertain. He asked if I was threatening him. I said I was not threatening. I was stating reality. I told him I did not want revenge. I wanted accountability, and I wanted him to stop rewriting what happened. I stood up, because I could feel the conversation turning into the old pattern, control and blame. I said if he wanted repair, he could start by telling the truth and accepting that I might still choose distance. Then I left and my hands shook, but my voice did not, and that felt like progress. After I left that meeting, Frank Lawson did not chase me, but he did not sleep either. Carol Lawson texted the next day, asking if we could talk, and her words looked shaky, like she was finally admitting the ground was moving. She said Frank kept repeating that I was overreacting, but his voice sounded scared, and fear does not show up unless something feels real. Evan Lawson stayed quiet, which told me he was either hiding or losing control, or both. A week later, Frank called, and his tone was different, less commanding, more cautious. He asked what I wanted, like he expected a number, like every problem can be paid off and buried. I told him I wanted the truth on record, and I wanted him to stop pretending Margaret Hale gift was his to reassign. Frank tried to argue about family, about sacrifice, about how Evan deserved the chance, but his words fell apart when I asked again, "Where is the money now?" He said some of it was spent on school, some was invested, and some was tied up, and the way he said it sounded like he did not even know the full picture. That was the moment I realized the fund was not just taken, it was handled recklessly. I ended the call before it turned into yelling, because I refused to be pulled back into the role of the guilty child. Afterward, I sat at my desk, and I wrote down every detail, date, time, and exact phrasing, because clarity is armor. I called Daniel Mercer, and I told him Frank was finally nervous. Daniel said, "Nervous people make mistakes, and mistakes create evidence." He advised me to keep everything, and to be patient, because pressure makes the truth leak out. I did not feel excited. I felt steady, because for the first time, Frank was the one feeling uncertainty, and I was the one holding facts. Not long after that, Evan Lawson reached out, and the message was almost polite. He wrote that he wanted to talk, and that we should not let the past define us. I had not heard that voice in years, and now it arrived right on schedule when he needed something. I did not reply. He sent another message, saying he was under stress, and Frank Lawson was being unfair, and the family needed unity. That word unity made my stomach tighten, because unity was what they demanded when they wanted silence. Carol Lawson called me that same week, and she admitted Evan was in trouble. She said his venture was failing, and he had debts, and Frank was furious because the success story was collapsing. Then she asked if I could help, just advice, just support, just a conversation, and I heard the same pattern, soft words with sharp expectations underneath. I told Carol I hoped Evan found a solution, but I was not funding the consequences of what they did. Carol cried and said she understood, but she also said Frank was desperate. I answered that desperation does not rewrite ownership, and it does not erase harm. After that call, I took a long walk, because I needed to move the heat out of my body. I thought about the kitchen table, the acceptance letter, and Frank telling me to learn a trade. Then I thought about my life now, my projects, my clients, and the skills I built without them. I realized they were not reaching out because they finally respected me. They were reaching out because their chosen investment was failing, and they wanted the child they dismissed to become their safety net. I refused, because being strong is not the same as being available for exploitation. Around that time, my work started getting noticed in a way I could not ignore. A regional magazine featured a project I led, and my name appeared in print beside a clean photo of a space I helped design. A client posted about our rebrand, and the post spread, and new inquiries began filling my inbox. It was not fame, but it was visibility, and visibility has a way of waking up people who love credit. Within days, Frank Lawson sent another message, suddenly warmer, suddenly proud, saying he always knew I would do well. Reading that line felt like stepping on broken glass, because he only spoke that way when he wanted access. Evan Lawson followed with a message that sounded like admiration, but it was thin, like a sales pitch. He said we should reconnect and maybe collaborate, because family should support family. I did not answer, because I knew support in their language meant I give, and they take. Daniel Mercer warned me that when public recognition appears, certain families try to attach themselves to it, to polish their image, and to rewrite history. He told me to keep my boundaries firm, and keep my records ready. That night I sat with Margaret Hale letter in my hands, and I read the lines about dignity and approval. I realized my grandmother understood this pattern long before I did. Frank wanted to act like a proud father now, but pride after harm is not love, it is branding. I told myself I would keep the focus where it belonged, on my work, on my future, and on the truth. If they wanted a clean story, they would have to clean it with accountability, not with my silence. Frank Lawson called again, and his voice sounded smoother than before, like he had rehearsed. He said he saw the article, and he said he was proud, and he said he always knew I would find my way. I let the words hang, because pride after cruelty feels like theft in a nicer suit. Frank asked if we could meet, and he hinted that people were talking, and the family name mattered. That was the real reason. Not love, not concern, but image. I told him I would meet only if we spoke about the fund directly, and only if he stopped acting like the past was a misunderstanding. Frank sighed, then said he did what he thought was best, and he said Evan Lawson needed the opportunity more. I reminded him that the money came from Margaret Hale, and it was meant for me, and he knew that when he moved it. Frank said Margaret had no right to control his decisions, and I said Margaret had every right to protect her granddaughter, and she did. Frank went quiet, and then he tried to shift into guilt, asking if I wanted him to suffer forever. I told him I did not want suffering. I wanted accountability. I said if he wanted repair, he could start by telling the truth to the relatives he fed, and by admitting he chose Evan over me, without checking facts, without listening, without care. Frank asked what I wanted, like he expected a number, and I told him I wanted transparency, paperwork, and a clear explanation of where the $175,000 went. The silence on the line lasted long enough to tell me he did not have a clean answer. I ended the call politely, and I wrote down every detail, because polite does not mean unprepared. I met Daniel Mercer again, and I brought everything: old texts, notes, and the letter from Margaret Hale. Daniel explained that if the fund was held under a custodial structure, then the custodian has a legal duty to use it for the named child. He said moving it to another child can create serious problems, especially if records show intent. He told me we needed to request documents, bank statements, transfer history, and anything that shows how Frank Lawson handled the account. I asked what happens if the money was invested and lost, and Daniel said that depends on whether the actions were prudent and whether they served the beneficiary. He said certain laws exist to protect minors, because adults sometimes treat children assets like personal property. Hearing that made my chest tighten, because that is exactly what Frank did. Daniel warned me that family pressure would increase, because people panic when paper trails appear. He told me to stay calm and to avoid emotional arguments, because facts travel further than anger. On the way home, Carol Lawson called, and she sounded frightened. She said Frank was furious that I was talking to a lawyer, and he said I was betraying the family. I told her that stealing from your child is the betrayal, and seeking clarity is not cruelty. Carol cried, and she admitted she did not understand the paperwork back then, and she trusted Frank to do the right thing. I told her trust does not erase responsibility, and I asked one question: did she ever see statements? Carol hesitated, then said no, Frank handled everything. That answer told me the truth was not only about money, it was about control. Evan Lawson showed up at my office building one afternoon, unannounced, wearing a confident smile that did not reach his eyes. He acted like we were close, like years of mocking never happened. He said he heard I was doing well, and he said he was proud of me, and he said we should catch up. I told him I was busy, and I asked what he wanted, because I was done with performances. Evan sighed, then admitted his venture was struggling and he needed support, connections, maybe even a loan. He said it would be temporary, and he said family helps family. I looked at him, and I remembered the kitchen table, his grin, his jokes about my future, and Frank Lawson telling me to learn a trade. I told Evan that he already took my college fund, and I would not finance his next mistake. Evan's face hardened, and he said I was bitter, and he said Frank made the decision, not him. I answered that he benefited, he defended it, and he enjoyed it, and those choices count. Evan tried a softer tone, saying we were young, saying we should move on, but his eyes kept flicking around the lobby, like he was nervous about being seen. That was when I understood. He was not here for reconciliation, he was here for resources. And he wanted to leave before the truth caught him. I told him Daniel Mercer was requesting records, and Evan blinked hard, like the word records hit him in the ribs. He asked if I was serious, and I said yes, because the money was never his to burn. Evan left quickly, and the elevator doors closed on his anger. I went back upstairs, and I kept working, because my life was not a rescue boat for the people who pushed me overboard. A few days after Evan Lawson left my office lobby, Daniel Mercer called with an update, and his tone was serious. He said the initial records showed a clear transfer, and the timing matched the year Frank Lawson told me the fund was no longer mine. The account was structured in a way that tied Frank duties to me, not to Evan, and that mattered. Daniel explained it plainly. The money was not a family pool. It was meant for a specific beneficiary, and that beneficiary was me. Hearing that did not feel like triumph. It felt like a deep ache, because it confirmed what I always knew, but could never prove. Daniel said more documentation was coming, and he advised me to stay quiet publicly, because people like Frank often try to control the narrative when they feel cornered. That same night, Carol Lawson called, and she sounded shaken. She said, Frank was yelling, and Evan was blaming everyone, and the house felt like a storm. Carol asked if I could stop, just for now, because things were getting ugly. I told her that ugliness did not start with me. It started when Frank moved money. That was not his. Carol cried, and she said she never thought it would go this far. I answered that it went far the moment they took my future and laughed. After the call, I sat with my laptop open, looking at Margaret Hale letter, and I felt grateful she left me a lifeline, but I also felt furious that I needed one. I did not post online, and I did not tell coworkers. I kept living my life, because my life was already built, but I also kept my spine straight, because truth is a kind of protection, and I was done letting them hide behind family language. Frank Lawson requested a meeting again, and this time it was not a command, it was an offer. He suggested a nice restaurant, and he said we could talk calmly, like adults, and find a way forward. The change in tone made me wary, because Frank only softened when he needed something. I agreed to meet, but I brought Daniel Mercer advice with me. Stay factual, stay brief, and do not accept vague promises. Frank arrived early, posture rigid, eyes sharp, but the anger was covered by a forced smile. He said he did not realize I felt so hurt, and he said he was sorry for how things landed. He still avoided clear responsibility, so I redirected. I asked for the records, and I asked for his explanation, and I asked why he moved money meant for me. Frank said he did it for the family, and he said Evan Lawson needed the chance, and he said I would have been fine. I told him fine is not the same as respected, and survival is not consent. Frank asked what it would take to end this, and I said accountability. I said he needed to admit the truth to the relatives, and he needed to stop telling people he paid for my education, because that was another lie he had been spreading. Frank's jaw tightened, and he asked if I would settle, like this was a business deal. I said I would not settle for silence. I said I wanted the truth on paper, and I wanted him to understand that my life is not a shield for his reputation. Frank looked trapped, because he wanted a clean ending, but clean endings require clean actions, and his were not. After that meeting, Carol Lawson asked to see me alone, and I agreed to a short conversation in a quiet park. She looked exhausted, and for the first time she did not hide behind polite phrases. She said she should have fought Frank Lawson, and she should have protected me, and she did not because she was scared. She admitted she let Frank control the money, the narrative, and the house, and she convinced herself it was normal. Carol said she saw Evan Lawson become entitled, and she kept hoping he would grow out of it. She said she told herself I was strong, and I would land on my feet, and now she understood that strength should not have been my burden. I listened, and I felt compassion, but I did not let compassion erase the past. I told her I appreciated her honesty, and I told her honesty is a start, not a finish. I said I did not need her to beg, I needed her to change. Carol asked if I hated her, and I said no, but I also said love without protection is not enough. She nodded, and she did not argue. Before she left, she asked if I could ever come home for a holiday, and I told her I did not know. I said home is not a table. It is safety, and safety takes time, and sometimes distance is the only way to keep it. Carol cried quietly, and then she let me go, and that felt like the first respectful thing she had done in years. Daniel Mercer sent a formal letter to Frank Lawson, and the tone was calm, but it carried weight. It requested complete records, statements, transfers, and documentation for the education account tied to my name. When Frank received it, he did not call to apologize, he called to accuse. He said I was attacking the family, and he said I was embarrassing him, and he said I was being greedy. I listened, and I let him run out of steam, because anger often arrives when facts are close. Then I told him greed is taking what was meant for your daughter and calling it leadership. Frank tried to pivot, saying he did not understand the rules and he did what any father would do. I asked him why the transfer paperwork existed, if he thought it was harmless. He went quiet. Then he blamed Evan Lawson and said Evan pressured him and he only wanted the family to win. That was the first time I heard Frank shift responsibility, and it told me he could see the cliff edge. Later that night, Carol Lawson texted me saying Frank was furious and Evan was panicking and the house felt like a courtroom. She begged me to stop before something broke. I told her something broke years ago, and I was only naming it now. When I hung up, I felt steady, but my chest still hurt, because truth does not erase grief. It only ends denial. I opened Margaret Hale letter again, and I read her words about dignity. I realized dignity sometimes looks like paperwork, and patience, and refusing to accept a story that was built to silence you. Evan Lawson called me from a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, he spoke fast, like he was selling an emergency. He said Frank Lawson was spiraling, and Carol Lawson was crying, and I was ruining everyone. He said the money was already gone, and bringing it up now was pointless, and I should move on. I told him I moved on years ago. But moving on does not mean accepting theft as normal. Evan said he did not steal. He just used what Frank gave him, and he said I should blame Frank, not him. I told Evan he celebrated it, he defended it, and he mocked me while spending it. Evan's voice sharpened, and he said I was bitter because I did not have the courage to take risks. I said risk is easy when you use someone else's future. Then I told him Daniel Mercer had confirmed the account was tied to me, and the transfer was documented, and that fact matters. Evan stopped talking for a beat, and the silence sounded like fear. He asked what I wanted, and I said accountability and truth, and a record that cannot be rewritten. Evan tried one more angle, saying we could settle privately and keep it quiet. I told him quiet is what protected them for years, and I was done participating. After I ended the call, I sat in my office, and I watched the city move outside my window, and I felt something clear. Evan still believed the goal was comfort, not justice. I did not need revenge, but I did need the truth to stand, because the next person they hurt might not have a Margaret Hale, or a Daniel Mercer, or a way out. A week later, Frank Lawson and Evan Lawson showed up at my workplace, unannounced, dressed like they were coming to claim something. The receptionist called me, sounding unsure, and I could tell they were trying to look important. I stepped into the lobby, and Frank stood straight, face tight, jaw set, like he could intimidate me into surrender. Evan hovered beside him, eyes scanning the space, as if he expected people to stare. Carol Lawson was not there, and that felt like a choice, because she could not handle the heat. Frank started talking about family and forgiveness, and how we should fix this privately. Evan added that we should be practical, because the money was complicated, and everyone made mistakes. I did not raise my voice. I asked why they came to my job, instead of telling the truth at home. Frank said I forced his hand, and I said no, the paper trail forced his hand. I pulled out a folder, not dramatic, just prepared, and I showed him the timeline Daniel Mercer had organized, transfers, dates, and the account naming me as the beneficiary. Frank's eyes flickered, and his mouth tightened, and he looked less certain. Evan tried to laugh it off, but the laugh died quickly. I told them I would not meet in secret, and I would not accept vague apologies. I said if Frank wanted repair, he could start by admitting publicly that he redirected money that was not his to redirect. Evan started to argue, but I cut in calmly and said I was not their safety net and I was not their excuse. Then I ended the conversation and I walked back toward the elevator because my life was upstairs and their drama was not my job. After Frank Lawson and Evan Lawson left my office lobby, I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm, and that calm surprised me. Years earlier, I would have shaken for hours, replaying every word, wondering if I sounded rude. Now, I only wondered if they finally understood that I was not a child they could corner. Daniel Mercer called that afternoon, and he said showing them the timeline was smart because it removed their favorite weapon, confusion. He told me Frank was likely to escalate, not because he was right, but because he was scared. The next day, Carol Lawson left a voicemail, asking me to call her back, voice thin, like she had been crying. I waited until evening, then I called, and she answered on the first ring. Carol said Frank was furious, and Evan was panicking, and they were both blaming each other. She said Frank kept saying I was poisoning the family, but she could hear fear under his anger because he knew the records were real. Carol asked what I wanted, and I told her the same thing I had said from the start. I wanted the truth acknowledged, and I wanted the paper trail handled like adults, not hidden, like shame. Carol whispered that Frank was talking about settling and paying me something just to make it stop. I told her I was not selling silence, and I was not letting them buy a clean ending without accountability. I said, if Frank wanted to repair anything, he needed to admit what he did, and he needed to stop using my success as proof that I was fine. Carol went quiet. Then she said she finally understood. That fine is not the same as cared for. After we hung up, I went back to my work, because my life did not pause for their crisis. A new client meeting ran late, a deadline tightened, and I stayed focused, because focus is how I survived the first betrayal. That night, I opened Margaret Hale letter again, and I read the lines about dignity, and I realized something simple. They were not angry because I asked for the truth. They were angry because the truth no longer belonged to them. Frank Lawson sent a message saying he wanted to resolve this, and he used words like compromise and peace, as if I was the one who started the fire. He offered to pay me back in pieces, over time. And he said we could keep it private, so the family would not be embarrassed. I stared at the message, and I felt the old pattern trying to slip in, the idea that my job was to make things easier for them. I told Daniel Mercer about the offer, and Daniel said private deals can be useful, but only if they include clear terms, documented admissions, and no gagging silence. He said I should decide what mattered most, money, truth, or boundaries, because those are not always packaged together. I thought about Margaret Hale, about how she wrote that dignity is not for sale, and I knew my answer. I wrote back to Frank Lawson, and I kept it short. I said I would not accept any agreement that required secrecy, and I would not accept payments without a written acknowledgement of what happened. Frank responded with anger, calling me stubborn, calling me ungrateful, saying I was destroying the family over money. I answered once, and only once. I said the family was damaged when he chose Evan Lawson, and laughed at my future. And truth is not destruction, it is cleanup. After that, I stopped replying, because the conversation had turned into manipulation again. I went to work the next morning, sat in a meeting, and presented a project like my heart was not heavy. That was a skill I hated learning, functioning while hurt, but it kept me alive. Later, Carol Lawson called, voice shaking, and she asked if I could please accept something, anything, because Frank was unraveling. I told her that unraveling was his responsibility, and mine was protecting the life I built. I said I was willing to hear a real apology, but I would not trade the truth for quiet. When the call ended, I felt tired, but steady. I realized I did not need them to understand my boundary. I only needed to keep it. The pressure finally forced Frank Lawson to do what he avoided for years: speak plainly. A relative called me, someone who used to ignore my messages, and she sounded shaken. She said Frank had told the family there was a misunderstanding about the college fund, and he needed time to sort it out. Even then, he tried to soften the truth, but the fact that he spoke at all meant the old story was cracking. Daniel Mercer told me that once a lie leaves the private house and enters a paper trail, it becomes harder to control. Evan Lawson started sending frantic messages, saying I was ruining his life, saying his debt was not my business, saying we should keep this in the family. I did not answer, because I knew his goal was not repair, it was escape. Carol Lawson called and admitted she had finally confronted Frank, and she told him his pride was costing everyone. Carol said she told Evan that entitlement is not a plan, and she said she was tired of watching men in her house decide who deserves safety. Hearing that was strange, because it sounded like a mother I needed when I was 18. I did not celebrate it, but I recognized it, because change matters, even late. Frank sent me a final message that week, shorter than all the others. He said he was sorry for how he handled things, and he said he should have listened. He did not write a full confession, but the words were closer to truth than anything before. I showed it to Daniel, and Daniel said it was a start, but starts are not endings. I kept my focus on my work, and I kept my boundaries firm, because I had learned that regret often appears when consequences arrive, not when harm is done. Still, as the week ended, I felt a small shift in the air. The family story was no longer clean, and that was not my cruelty. That was reality, finally catching up. By the time the dust started to settle, I understood that the most important thing was never the money. $175,000 could have changed my path, made it smoother, made it safer, but it would not have changed who my family chose to be. Frank Lawson took what was meant for me, and he tried to justify it as wisdom. Evan Lawson spent it like it was proof of his worth, and he mocked me while doing it. Carol Lawson stayed quiet until the consequences arrived, and then she finally found her voice. I did not get back the years I lost, and I did not need to. I had already built a life that did not depend on their table, their approval, or their version of the truth. Daniel Mercer helped put the facts on paper, and Margaret Hale left me a rope when I needed one. That rope was not just $12,000, it was belief, written in ink when no one else believed me. My work kept growing, and I kept creating, and every project felt like another brick in a foundation they could not touch. When people asked about my story, I did not dramatize it, and I did not hide it. I said, my father chose my brother, and I chose myself. I said I learned a trade, the trade of resilience, planning, and protecting my dignity. Frank could live with his choices, Evan could live with his debts, and Carol could live with her silence. I would live with my work, my peace, and the people who showed up when I had nothing. If anyone wonders why I do not rush back to make the family feel comfortable, the answer is simple. I do not return to places that only value me once my success becomes useful.